Hi everyone, Nick here from Conservation Careers and welcome to the podcast. Now today I'm speaking with Dr Gemma Harper, who's the Chief Executive of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, or JNCC for short. Now JNCC is a public body that provides a shared scientific nature conservation service for the UK. This helps the governments within the UK to achieve their wildlife conservation objectives. And just 1 year into her role as chief executive, we talk in the episode about the important role JNCC plays within biodiversity conservation efforts and also her approach to leading the organisation. We also discuss her career path to date before Gemma shares her advice for people like you who might be seeking to follow in her footsteps. It's a wide-ranging, informative and really enjoyable conversation. As always, enjoy.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm Gemma Harper. I'm the Chief Executive of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, also known as JNCC.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast, Gemma. It's great to kind of talk to you and to get to know you a little bit and also hear more about JNCC. Probably the best starting point actually is to talk a little bit about the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, or JNCC as we're going to probably call it from here on in within the podcast. For people who don't know what JNCC is, or for a layperson, how would you describe it to people? What is your role as an organisation?
So JNCC is a public body, and with a statutory advisor to the four governments of the UK on all things nature conservation and nature recovery. And the reason we exist is because environmental policy is devolved. So although the United Kingdom will negotiate targets internationally for nature for the UK, those targets then need to be implemented within the UK and within the four nations of the UK. So we need to find a way of ensuring that we can coordinate and be consistent in the evidence base that supports the negotiations of those domestic and international targets. So JNCC fills a really important role in the relationship we have both with the UK government, but also the four governments in the devolved nations. And we fundamentally produce evidence for nature recovery, but also provide advice based on scientific evidence to policymakers. So we like to say that we translate science into action for nature conservation and recovery. We're very much at that science policy interface.
Right. Okay, that's super clear. Thank you. Could you give us a bit of an idea of the sorts of kind of policy objectives or perhaps even international commitments that an organisation like JNCC are helping to advise on and provide the evidence to government around? Can you sort of just bring that to life a little bit? And I guess an additional question alongside that, if I can, sort of, how can governments and how do governments go about helping to conserve wildlife more generally? I guess the two things are quite sort of intertwined.
First of all, you need to know what's happening.
Yep.
What's happening with biodiversity, and what we know is the compelling evidence base that there is a biodiversity crisis, and there are cumulative pressures on biodiversity ranging from climate change to habitat loss to pollution, a whole range. And unless we intervene and do things differently, the trajectory is incredibly poor. So we talk about bending the curve on biodiversity loss, which effectively means stopping and then reversing that loss. So in order to do that, you need to understand what's happening within our ecosystems, within our habitats for particular species that make up those habitats and ecosystems. And JNCC, with our partners, the statutory nature conservation bodies across the four countries, the UK, we provide that scientific evidence about the state and change of nature. So we can produce very convincing and compelling scientific evidence about those species, habitats, ecosystems that are under threat, and importantly, why they are. And once you know what's happening in terms of the state of nature, and once you know why that's happening in terms of the cumulative pressures on those natural systems, and then the impacts on us as a species within that set of ecosystems, then you can start to advise the decision makers on the direction that they ought to be going in based on that evidence base. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions, incredibly important for everybody and everything on the planet. Making sure that we have sustainable use of our natural systems and our natural assets. So we recognise that they are our life support system and we are going to need to use them across the globe. But to do so sustainably means that we're not having ongoing detrimental impact to the point where you effectively destroy species and destroy habitats and destroy ecosystems. So you need to know there has to be a feedback loop that tells us that the activities, whether we are taking or we are adding, whatever we are doing, that those ecosystems, habitats and species are all sustainable for the future. At the moment, we are not collectively doing that sufficiently. That's why we're seeing this downward trend in biodiversity, and there are all kinds of serious consequences for functioning ecosystems that provide us with water and clean air and food and a whole range of services, in addition to the value in and of themselves. So there's a whole series of things that take you to a point where we might be providing advice to policymakers, to ministers, to governments across the world that says, for example, in this part of land or sea, it's really important that we designate and protect. And this is what that looks like, and this is what that means in terms of activity, because it doesn't necessarily mean don't do anything. It means do it much more consciously, and also to recognize increasingly that nature provides the solution in many cases to climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. We have a growing and equally compelling evidence base about the fact that these crises, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, are utterly dependent on one another, and the solutions are also interrelated. So conserving nature and restoring nature has multiple benefits, and it's that valuation which is really important, that we understand the value of nature in and of itself, but also in terms of all these services it provides, and that we recognise that we're part of nature, and that when we harm nature, we harm ourselves.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. So in some ways, and forgive me if I'm wrong, you almost act like a watchdog for nature. You know, that the delegating bodies within the kind of four nations collect the information. They do a lot of the conservation actions on the ground too. You bring that together and you provide that evidence to government to say whether something's working, whether it isn't working, what we should be doing more or less of, but you're not implementing on the ground. That goes down to the kind of devolved nations. Have I got that right?
Absolutely right. I might not use the word watchdog,
Yeah.
but we have a legal basis, the NERC Act, and therefore we have statutory responsibilities to provide that scientific advice to governments. And you can provide advice quietly, you can provide advice privately, you can provide advice publicly, and you can provide advice loudly. I think we are perhaps moving in that direction, given the scale, the challenge, the pace of damage to natural systems. Yeah,
right. Okay. What does JNCC look like then in terms of its structure? And can you give us an idea of some of the programs or the projects that are underway within the organisation to deliver upon some of the things we've already discussed?
So we're relatively small but perfectly formed. There's about 280 people in JNCC. We have two main offices, one in Aberdeen and one in Peterborough, where the headquarters are. And we will be moving to a new building in Peterborough in the new year and sharing offices with Natural England and Environment Agency, which actually be very helpful for collaborative working. We have a very diverse set of skills, everything from data and digital skills into our own HR and comms, into a variety of scientific fields.
Mm-hmm.
So we operate as a public body, but as a sort of business in and of ourselves. And that's important for our impartiality. It's important that we operate as an organisation that is owned by the 4 countries. We are an arm's length body of DEFRA, and we have a very important relationship into DEFRA, but equally we have important relationships into Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So we maintain that ability to sustain ourselves as far as possible. We are people in JNCC are very passionate about what they do and our mission for nature. So you will find very dedicated, very conscientious, very talented people who want to be part of this mission and who recognise that for many people it's a bit more of a kind of vocation in some ways. We have to maintain our scientific rigour and impartiality, but the dedication enables us to be really creative and innovative about how we do that. So you're absolutely right to say we don't really do implementation on the ground or at sea. We advise on that, but we will, for example, innovate in terms of data and the scientific evidence and advice that's being drawn from it. One example of that is how we are combining citizen science or volunteer network data through our partner organisations like BTO or RSPB, and combining that really important data that's gathered and quality assured and connecting into other forms of data, for example, Earth observation. So using sort of cutting edge satellite tracking information and being able to combine those sorts of data sets enables us to look at quite granular levels of change on the land and to see what's happening. So it's that kind of, we're not physically doing it necessarily, but we are. Our chief scientist is sort of, Christine Maggs likes to call us a digital twin, an ecological digital twin, because we're gathering that data, we're generating that evidence, we're combining it into analytical models, and we are using that to provide advice to governments. And all of that requires a very high level of scientific rigor, a high level of consistency. So we're talking about apples and apples and not apples and pears, and the ability to coordinate across the countries, and the ability to work with the countries and say, well, we think we're on track. You think you're on track. Do we think you're on track? Do we think collectively that the UK is going to achieve nature recovery and the particular targets for each of the countries? And that's actually incredibly challenging because natural systems are so dynamic. There isn't one metric that we can look at, like reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to get to a position where we can model nature recovery in the way that we're modeling climate. But it's really interesting to think about baselines. So where do you start?
Yeah.
Really interesting to think about, what does it mean? What does it look and feel like to have a world in which nature has recovered, and how would you know? And the climate effect on that is also really interesting. So there are going to be winners and losers in terms of species and habitats in relation to climate change as well. So it's incredibly challenging and complex. However, the UK is very advanced on our understanding of what's happening in our natural systems. We have some of the best data collection that happens locally, that happens regionally, that happens nationally, and we use that data and our capability to generate, quality assure and analyse that data to assess how policies are working. And then we also use that to go out and support countries who are fundamentally looking to raise, to alleviate poverty and to raise standard of living through protection of their natural environment. So when we go overseas, that is fundamentally about supporting capability building in country and providing our advice on where they might want to, for example, designate marine protected areas. And that's an example of working collaboratively across with other organisations like CFAS and MMO, Interdefra and FCDO on the Blue Planet Fund, which is a really historic investment of official development aid, ODA, into global nature recovery as well as domestic nature recovery. And JNCC is uniquely placed as the only statutory nature conservation advisor to the UK to provide the international link there, both across sea and land.
And I think what's really interesting when we think about the UK, and something that's often perhaps overlooked by many, is this idea of overseas territories. I mean, the UK, I was reading up before, there are 14 overseas territories and they cover a combined area 7 times that of the UK. And how important are these overseas territories for JNCC's work, and also some of the goals that we're kind of working towards as a society? So things like 30% of protected areas of the marine environment by 2030, do they have an important role there? And how does that link into JNCC's efforts to conserve wildlife?
JNCC has a very long-standing and very positive relationship with overseas territories. We have been providing advice for many years through various programs, and that's a really good example of working with the territories, them defining what they need, and then working back with us to see how we can support them in building their capability. Disaster resilience is a really important area here when we talk about making sure that the work we're doing for nature is also for, tackling climate, supporting people. The support and advice we've been giving overseas territories on the importance of their natural systems in terms of resilience to climate-induced surge and floods and so on is a really strong example where you can help support the implementation of nature-based solutions that are benefiting nature, that are benefiting people, that are benefiting dealing with climate change. And you will know, Nick, that they are incredibly biodiverse, our overseas territories. And so we have some really important habitats and species, ecosystems there that we are actively supporting protection of, but doing it from their perspective. You can't just go into countries and start, telling them, or territories, and start saying what we think. It's really, really, really important to take a partnership approach, a collaborative approach, and for the countries and the territories themselves to define what it is they think is important and what they need, and for us to be able to be responsive to that. Very important. And the other thing to say, of course, is it enables us sometimes to test things on a sort of smaller scale that we could then bring back to the UK. So actually it can be quite a useful kind of policy lab in the same way that the 4 countries are. So our bilateral relationships with the 4 countries are really important too, because we might be able to do something in Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, that it wouldn't be so easily done in England, but actually demonstrate the idea and bring it back. So that idea of sort of natural experiments or policy labs using different countries, different landscapes or seascapes is really part of the innovation that's at the heart of JNCC.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I guess this idea of economies of scale as well, working together, removing duplication of effort, taking great examples of what's working in one place and enabling that to happen somewhere else. You can really see a kind of really unique, important role for what it is you and your organization are delivering against. Yeah. I'm really interested in your role, particularly also, Gemma, as a sort of chief executive at JNCC, and you've been in position now for a year or so.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. What's it like being a chief executive? I mean, not many people listening will have had the opportunity to be a chief executive. Like, how do you see your role and what are you responsible for? How would you describe your job to someone?
I mean, it's fantastic. It genuinely is. For me, it's the right fit at the right time. And when we come on to talk about careers, I think that's incredibly important. And for your listeners, there's absolutely no reason that all of them shouldn't be thinking, if they want, that's a role to aspire to, because it is within reach. It's not something I thought I was aiming for, but what drove me here was my passion for nature, my commitment to public service, and absolute fascination with all things science. So it is that perfect fit. What's it like being a chief executive? It's a privilege. It's a privilege because the job is fundamentally about creating an environment where you support people to thrive, and that's the job, and in providing they deliver and have rewarding jobs and deliver the mission for nature, and that's thinking through, experimenting, testing, trying different things about how you do that, how you create that learning culture, psychologically safe learning culture for people to experiment and innovate and be creative, how you ensure you are as inclusive as you possibly can be so that we avoid groupthink, we get diversity of thought and background, compelling evidence about being much more productive in terms of risk taking and good quality decision making. It's being a chief executive is fundamentally about people, other people, and asking yourself the question every single minute of every single day about why should anybody be led by me, and that's quite humbling. You really need to think hard about that. It's not about telling people what to do. It's not about being at the front. It's not about, well, sometimes you are the ambassador, absolutely, and that's a role I really enjoy. But it's about everybody else in the organization and trying to make their working lives as joyful as they can be. Because I'm a firm believer that if that's the case, then people will stay, they will be more productive, they will be more innovative, we will get better solutions, and we will deliver our mission for nature. You don't get it right all the time, so you have to be able to be open and honest about it's okay to try things, it's okay not to get it right all the time. I do have a reasonable degree of autonomy, which I enjoy, to do that strategic thinking about the organization and where we are now and where we want to be and how to get there, what the transition stage is and what the transformational stage is. And you get to work with non-executives, as part of your board. Our committee is our board. And that's a really enjoyable experience because you get that different perspective, you get the benefit of that wisdom, you get the support, the challenge. Because you can, you are, in a sense, you're kind of on your own, you are the figurehead. So you have to create, and what I found always beneficial is to create and maintain, sustain your networks, both your personal and professional networks. But having, a really dedicated, talented, passionate set of people working in the organization, having a board who are equally passionate and dedicated and bring a different perspective, means that it's an incredibly creative place to be, actually. And there's still the kind of things you need to do to run the organization, and that's important because you're an accounting officer, it's public money, we need to make sure that we are compliant in all those respects. Learn a lot about areas that previously, I had 20 years in the civil service, weren't at the forefront of your mind all the time because somebody else was doing it. Whether that's health and safety or working with trade unions or thinking about HR policy on whatever, you get such a breadth of opportunity to learn and have influence on a wide range of organizational areas. And what I found really interesting is I came to JNCC because I want to spend my working career for nature. And what I found is I really enjoy the organizational aspects of it. And that's been a delight for me.
Yeah, and that's how you're delivering against that mission, is building an organization and driving it forwards successfully with thriving staff to deliver for nature conservation. Yeah, and it really kind of comes across. How did you approach your job as chief executive then? It seems you have real clarity as to what it is you want to achieve and how you see your role. And it's a big role. But when you sort of started in the job, how did you set your priorities? How did you know where to start? You hear about chief execs and 100-day targets or whatever. I mean, did you have an approach, or have you?
But didn't read any of them.
Yeah.
I started as an interim chief exec.
Yep.
So I was on a sort of several month interview to begin with. So my first plan was to get the job.
Yeah.
But also to learn. You try and learn about the organisation. You learn about how it is and why it is, where the strengths are, where the opportunity is. It's really important to develop a good working relationship with the chair, Professor Colin Galbraith, who's my line manager, and with members of our board, our committee. Really important to develop a relationship and get to know the executive leadership team who I work with on a day-to-day basis. So understanding the organisation, developing relationships, some key ones quite early on.
Yep.
And also just testing out a few ideas early on, some of which landed, some of which didn't. People sometimes talk about values-based leadership, and that is my leadership. I lead this organisation or do anything I do in my career because I care about it. And knowing that and knowing the other things I care about has sort of driven my focus. So the mission of nature, are we doing everything we possibly can in our collaborations, our relationships, our judgments, our decision making to drive that mission? And we're revising our strategy at the moment to make sure that that's the case. Being an inclusive organisation is incredibly important to me. Because it's the right thing to do. Somebody, Rob Neal, who is an inclusion expert, said to me that diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. I think it's the best description ever of those words. And you have to make the choice to be inclusive all the time and prioritise that and make sure that you are not just attending to it because the latest thing has happened, but that you prioritise it in your leadership and your expectation of your leaders in your organisation every day. So I think that's been a driving force for me, and some of it's difficult. A lot of it's difficult, actually. And we've got a way to go in some areas, but both diversifying JNCC and diversifying the environmental sector more broadly with real change agents out there like Sarah Mukherjee from IEMA and others is incredibly important to me. So that's what I'm going to spend my energy doing, and becoming a learning organisation. And by that I mean being psychologically safe about what we do and why we do it, not having a same culture. Not that I think there was, but that there can be a deficit model to learning and development, which sort of says, well, here's a set of competencies, you don't quite reach them, so you've got 5 days a year to go and train yourself. It's just to me an approach to learning and development which has had its day. Learning is something I do every day. It's something I invest in. It's a mindset. It's an approach. It's fundamentally about your self-awareness as a leader, your impact on others, and your continual personal development and growth. And I think that's also where I've tried to put certainly the energy within the executive leadership team. And you need to role model that. If staff are saying to us, learning and development and career progression is really important to us, which it is, don't see their leaders investing in that, then ultimately they're not going to. So that's been really critical. So I don't have a sort of, here's my first 100 days. I had these are the 3 or 4 things I really care about. I'm going to see what it feels and looks like in JNCC, and found that you have extremely dedicated, passionate people about nature. That's wonderful. That's all the ingredients I need, and skilled people. That we have really active equality, diversity, and inclusion groups, the neurodiversity group. Have the foundation to take that forward. And on learning, I think that's a longer term, process, because people can very quickly, prioritize what they think is the day job, the stuff, the work. But actually, the work is, learning is work, and it's the most enjoyable part of work. Trying to slowly but surely rebalance the organisation so that every individual prioritises their learning and their work-life balance, and that will enable their career progression.
And what I seem to be hearing is a lot about just creating the right culture for individuals to thrive, and it being a safe place, a safe space where even failure is okay. It's because that's all about the innovation and learning that seems so important to you. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't say that I have been successful yet. I think this is an ongoing journey. People talk about culture quite a lot, don't they? But it's actually a really important discipline about where you put your energy every day. And can you look your organisation in the face and say, I live and breathe this in everything I do. And if I don't, that I expect you to hold me to account for it.
I'd like to switch gears again then, if I may, and think back a little bit and look at your career to date. We've heard about JNCC and what it's like to do your role right now, but when you look back at, you've mentioned, you worked for the civil service now for 20 years. What have been the kind of key stepping stones that you've taken in your career that have been important to get where you are today?
So I think it's, I was going to say it was in 3 parts, but now it's probably 4. So I studied psychology. I was fascinated by people, and I spent a long time in university and thought I wanted to be an academic because I like the idea of being a free thinker. And I did, a number of pieces of research and teaching and so on, and sort of tried that out. But it was kind of fortuitous. At the time, my cousin was working at the Office of National Statistics. And although as an academic, I'd done work for government, what was MAF then, prior to DEFRA, Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, DFID as was. So I didn't know that government valued evidence. I didn't know really that there were analysts or social scientists in government. So I'm a social scientist by training. I joined government social research 20 odd years ago in the Home Office. So I decided to see what it was like to be an evidence specialist in government. And my cousin was doing a similar thing at ONS. And I spent, the first part was being an academic and free thinking and doing interesting things. The second part was learning. I felt it was almost an apprenticeship, learning how to be a civil servant, learning how to be a government analyst, learning about the sort of evidence policy interface. And I spent the vast majority of my government career in evidence roles. I learned a lot about how it's generated, how it's used, how it's not used. And that was all in the criminal justice system. So first the Home Office and then the Ministry of Justice. And I was, I got promoted through that into the Ministry of Justice. And by the time I'd done that for 10 years, it did feel to me that there was something missing. And what was missing was the nature value. So when DEFRA advertised in 2010, I think it was, the first chief social scientist at DEFRA, that brought together people and nature and evidence in a way that was just too seductive. So I did everything I possibly could to get the job, and I did. And so then I was in a leadership position, in an evidence role, in an environmental department. And that third phase was very much about learning about leadership in an organization, learning about environmental policy and moving from evidence into policy. So at some point during that 10 years, about midway, I took the decision that I actually wanted to be nearer the action, because it can feel like you're slightly when you're providing evidence. So I positioned myself to get in a policy post. So that is a piece of advice. If there isn't the opportunity, create it. And then I started working on plant health policy, and then subsequently marine policy, and that was wonderful. I mean, that shift for me, being a social scientist by training, evidence in my DNA, evidence is what I, is kind of sacrosanct in many ways, but I really valued then moving into that policy space and understanding the policy making process, and the evidence is a really important part of that process, along with the politics and the deliverability and so on. And then I spent, very happy years in marine, and I was fortunate to be asked to support the national response to COVID for about a period of 4 or 5 months, working on food vulnerability, and that was extraordinary. That gave me a whole other different opportunity to see what an emergency response, real time, looked and felt like. And when I went back to marine, I felt that I did need a new challenge, and then that this job came up, and I felt, like I said, the mission was right for me, the environment was right in terms of evidence in the public sector where I wanted to be, and that's what brought me to this place. But I would say that for me, knowing what I care about, and then being able to create opportunities and position myself so that you kind of let it be known that you're interested. You can't be too shy and retiring. If there are things you want in your career, people will help you, but they know that that's what you want. And there's another kind of Venn diagram that I often talk to people that I coach and mentor about, which is, if you have in one of the circles, the kind of organization, one passion and one skills, this what really is, the thing you care about with the skill set you're able to deliver in the organization that's going to have impact. That's where I feel I am now. You're not always in that center place. You sometimes stuck in different parts of it, but it's sometimes quite a helpful kind of diagnostic tool in terms of careers as where you are now. Are you in the place you really care about? Do you have the right skill set? Is it having impact? And if not, what would it take to get you into that sweet spot?
Yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating. It's something we think and talk a lot about here as well. And that idea of impact's really interesting and important. So, in something you mentioned there, as you have evolved through your career and finding more impact as you've gone, or shifting more towards conservation and then shifting more towards policy and marine. And I guess sometimes we sort of find balance within our career, within the middle of that Venn diagram, and we find that sweet spot. But often it's a case of balancing. And when something's out of balance, sort of shifting back, recognizing that maybe the impact's missing. I'm in a great organization. I've got the skills that I need, but I'm not quite connecting to that impact of the work. I don't feel I connected through. What can I do day to day to connect to?
That's common experience for evidence specialists, because it is feel one step removed. So getting that more delivery experience, getting that more policy experience, getting that insight to that side of the world, I think is incredibly important. And it just strengthens your capability overall, because you have the evidence foundation. You're scientifically literate, and that's an incredibly important asset for nature recovery. I mean, absolutely essential.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any other advice you'd want to offer people who are listening, who might want to sort of follow in your footsteps and working nature conservation? They might be students or switchers or job seekers right now.
So having said I didn't sort of make a career plan in that sort of very structured way, I was very much led by my values. And I think that is what sort of propels me in a sense. So I think, either be really structured about it if that's your preference, or know what you care about so that you can get there. And it maybe there is kismet, but you create that opportunity by putting yourself out there. So finding what you might call your career compass, in that program, where are you? Are you at the sweet spot? Are you having impact on the thing you care about through your skill set? And if so, brilliant. How do you continue to do more of that and as you progress? But are you potentially, you have the skill set and you're in the organization that's having impact, it's not the thing you really the thing you're really passionate about? How would you move into that space, which might mean changing organization or department in an organization? So sort of understanding where you're, and also understanding it's fine to be anywhere. It's fine to be anywhere in that Venn diagram at any time. I was certainly in that, slightly drudgery between organisation and skills for when I wasn't involved in conservation. Secondly, really prioritise your personal development. That temptation to rely solely on our scientific expertise or technical capability or whatever our professional capability is, which is necessary but not sufficient to be a leader in this sector or any sector. So prioritizing your self-awareness, your understanding of your impact on other people, things that might feel a bit uncomfortable actually for some people, it's not necessarily what to do, but it's the modern way of, and it's the evidence-based way actually, of how you connect with people and how you lead organizations. And so really not just thinking about CPD in a formal sense, but thinking about it in an expansive way, that learning is something that should happen every day, be a lifelong learner, learn about yourself first of all. Practice your pitch. And so what are you offering? What is your USP? And I often talk to people that I coach about, start the sentence, what I bring is, because everybody else going for the job has got either the same or equivalent qualifications and probably similar experience. So what is going to differentiate you in this job? And are you able to articulate that? And that's got to be that's where the sense of authentic leadership comes from. That's about you and your personal qualities, about your values, as well as your capabilities, and being able to tell that story. Do your research, be a researcher. Find out about the sector, find out about the opportunities, find out about, if a job is advertised, try and speak to the advertising manager if you can. Do research about the role in the organisation. I've been on a lot of recruitment panels, and it still surprises me that it's kind of clear that people haven't been on the website, read the strategy, read the accounts, worked. You just need to show you care about the thing you're going for, and actively manage your career. Seek coaches, seek mentors, sponsors, maintain networks, use LinkedIn, be visible and available, and it will come to you.
So much good advice. That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely brimming with good advice there. A few just questions then, just to kind of round things off as we're kind of coming up to our time. You're, I guess, fairly desk-based, but you're clearly passionate about nature. How do you stay connected to nature? And is that important to you?
I spend as much time in my garden as I possibly can. We planted a wildflower lawn, which has just been transformational. The amount of moths and butterflies and flying things, and my ID is not brilliant, as you can tell, but we have hedgehogs and a fox and slow worm. We have created a smallish garden. We have tadpoles in a little butler sink. We have we have done the thing of creating space for nature in where we can, and getting out into nature as frequently as I can. I mean, here in Hampshire, there's some beautiful chalk streams, the coast, there's so many wonderful places to go to. And then as part of, now we are, learning to live with COVID, coming out of that has meant that we can meet in person, whether it's our board meetings, our executive meetings, team meetings, and trying to do as many field trips. So we had 2 recently, which is fascinating, and nothing beats a field trip. So we went to North Berwick Scottish Seabird Centre to see how they operate in terms of education and conservation, saw the gannets on Bass Rock, and saw the impact of avian influenza. I mean, you get a real sense of what's happening when you see it like that. It's quite stark. Fascinating organisation, brilliant chief executive Sue Davies there. And we also recently went with our committee to, the chairs and chief executives of the statutory nature conservation bodies to Woodwalton Fen, Triple SI, a fascinating place of history and ecology, and conservation and recovery. Saw a marsh harrier, a hobby, and you when the experts are kind of telling you, well, this is what management looks and feels like. This is what it means to manage a place. It gave me a sense that, I mean, they didn't use this word, but it gave me a sense of it's sort of like a nature incubator. If you can protect enough, and then you get these spillover effects, and that's what we're seeing in the area around the Fen. Extraordinary place in terms of peat and biodiversity. So I think, in personal and professional life, trying to actually get out on land and sea as much as possible. There's nothing to beat that understanding of what it takes, actually, the human commitment, energy. I mean, the Natural England colleagues there are doing a fantastic job. And we all know that nature, access to green and blue space is essential for our health and well-being. So with the right SPF and a hat, I might go for a walk later. It's quite hot today.
It is quite warm, isn't it? Yeah. And final question would be, are you optimistic for the future as well when we think about nature and wildlife and recovery? You talked about bending the curve earlier, bending the curve up. I mean, we do see and we hear a lot about doom and gloom within nature conservation. We are winning some battles, but we're generally kind of losing the war to conserve nature on this planet. How do you feel about the future? Do you think we can turn things around? Are you optimistic?
I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't think that. And I do understand eco-anxiety. I do understand the despair some people feel about whether it's an individual species or a habitat or global natural systems. People are many things, good and bad and ugly, but we are also ingenious, and we do have the solutions. We do know what to do. We know the problem, we know the solutions. It's all about implementation and delivery now. And optimism, so the realists will say the pessimists don't have an accurate reflection, and the optimists don't either. So it's not a word necessarily that I think is that helpful. What I think is helpful is I'm hopeful. And what hope said on a leadership development course, I was hearing this from the trainer, is that you hold at the same time both the likelihood that something will happen, the possibility that it doesn't have to. And I think that's the ability to hold those two thoughts at the same time. I think is hopeful. I don't think it's quite optimism, but it's the right driving force, because it means that I'm both a realist about it, but I'm also somebody who believes in the power of our ability to change the future and to create a nature positive future. But the stakes are just too high if we don't.
Yeah. And on that hopeful message, thank you so much, Gemma Harper, for jumping on the podcast. It's been really nice talking to you. getting to know you. I wish you all the very best in your important role. And if people want to find out a little bit more about you and JNCC more generally, where should we send them?
To the JNCC website, please, do jump on. And then we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're getting more active on social media. And yes, please do reach out. We'll be delighted to hear from any of the listeners.
Wonderful. Thank you once again.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people. Now, if you want our help to get clear and get started and get hired as a professional conservationist, I recommend you enroll in our free online training program, exploring how to get a conservation job. So if you're a student, a job seeker, or a career switcher, you'll learn the golden rule about how to get started, the key mistakes to avoid, and also we'll answer your biggest questions. You can check that out at conservation-careers.com/free. See you soon.